then I ask you to fully support this bill. The trade war that China has been carrying out, decimating manufacturing in our nation, must not go without full debate and a full response. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
The Senator from Florida.
Madam President, I ask for unanimous consent that I be recognized to speak as of the morning business.
Without objection.
Madam President, I stand today here to talk about the case of Yusuf Nadarkhani, and before I do, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that the privileges of the floor be granted for today's session for a member of my staff, Viviana Bovo, who's been working on this matter with me.
Without objection.
Yusuf Nadarkhani was arrested in October of 2009 in Iran, and his crime that he's accused of is the crime of apostasy. And I want to read to you the charges against him pursuant to a document that was signed by two judges, and I'm going to say their names because I think one day they'll be held accountable for things like this. Their names are Morteza Fazel and Azizola Razagni. I think I got it right. But here's what it says. This is Mr. Yusuf Nadarkhani, son of Bayram, 32 years old, married, born in Rasht in the state of Gilan, is convicted of turning his back on Islam, the greatest religion, the prophecy of Muhammad at the age of 19, the document states. It goes on to say he has often participated in Christian worship and organized home church services, evangelizing, and he's been baptized, and he's baptized others, converting Muslims to Christianity. He has been accused of breaking Islamic law, that from puberty until the age of 19, the year 1996, he was raised a Muslim in a Muslim home. During court trials, he denied the prophecy of Muhammad and the authority of Islam. He has stated that he is a Christian and no longer a Muslim. During many sessions in court, with the presence of his attorney and a judge, and he has been sentenced to execution by hanging for this alleged crime. That's what he's been convicted for. That conviction, by the way, was upheld by appeals court in that province of Gilan in September of 2010. Now, in July, the Supreme Court of Iran overturned the death sentence. Again, this is according to media reports. Did not overturn the conviction, by the way, just the death sentence, and they sent the case back to his hometown of Rasht. Here's what's happened since it's gone back to his hometown. Now, the deputy governor of that province says that while he's guilty of apostasy, that's not why they sentenced him to death. They've actually come up with some new charges. They say that he is a security threat, particularly that he is an extortionist, and they claim that he's a rapist. By the way, they've never said this before until this case was sent back to them. Oh, and by the way, he's also a Zionist, which in and of itself, according to them, is punishable by death in Iran. That's where the case stands today. And so there's been reports time and again about what's happening in Iran with this case. His lawyers have now been publicly saying they expect to know by Saturday whether their client will be executed in Iran, quite frankly, for the crime of not just being a Christian, but of converting others to Christianity. Obviously, this is an outrage. And I'm glad to see that voices from this government and from all over the world have expressed themselves against it. But I think it's important for us to express ourselves against this as well for the following reasons. Number one is this is a time when Americans and this nation is increasingly asked to turn to international bodies to resolve disputes. And so let's visit that for a moment, because we have international bodies and we have international conventions that Iran has signed, particularly two. One is the Declaration of Human Rights. They signed it in 1948. The other is the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. They signed that in 1966. And if you sign these covenants, any nation who signed on to this, these sorts of activities by a court in your country are unconscionable, illegal. They violate these things. So I'm still waiting, and hopefully we'll see some sort of action on behalf of the United Nations and nations like Russia and China, for example. Of course, it'll be difficult for China to speak out against oppressing religious minorities when they do that quite often in that country as well. But that being said, we're interested to see where some of these other countries will be on this matter. And we're obviously very encouraged that the European Union has spoken about this matter. We'd like to see some of these other countries step up. We'd like to see the United Nations take a break from figuring out ways to sanction or take on Israel and maybe focus a little bit on these sorts of things, where people are facing a hangman's noose because of their religion. By the way, in Iran, this sort of thing is not just happening to Christians, and not only Christians feel oppressed, but non-Shiite Muslims feel great oppression. But here's the greater point. Beyond this outrage, and let me just say that I encourage everyone to pray tonight for the safety of Yusuf Nadarkhani and for his family, and we hope that this will resolve itself. We hope that in that nation and in that government of Iran there are reasonable people that realize what an outrage, what an atrocity, what a human rights violation, what a crime it would be for this man not just to be sentenced to death, to even be in jail. The second thing I would say is we should feel sorry for the people of Iran. It's hard to believe that the vast majority of people in that country agree with us. And in fact, they look at their government and say, you are isolating us from the world. If the people of Iran want to know what it is that is isolating them from progress in this 21st century, they need to look no further than Tehran and the people who are running that government. And it's sad. Because I think going back to 2009, the evidence is there that especially young people in that country, they would just want to have normal lives and live in a normal country. And instead, their country is being run by individuals who think this sort of thing is okay. By the way, I would also point out to nations, for example, leaders in places like Venezuela and other nations of Latin America that so warmly welcome these leaders from Iran when they visit. This is who you're doing business with. And I would encourage the people of those countries in Latin America to turn to their leaders and ask them, why do we have a relationship with people like this? Why are people like this being invited to come into our countries and do business with us and tour our streets as heroes? This is who they are. Forget the rhetoric and put anything aside. You want to know what the leadership and the government of Iran is about? It is about this. This is who they are. And I can think of no other case before us today with regards to Iran that more clearly outlines the monsters that we're dealing with in that government than this case that I've outlined here today. And I think there's a broader conversation to be had about what Iran means. There's a lot of things going on in the world, but what's happening in Iran is important. And Iran's neighbors know it. Whether they'll admit it publicly or not, Iran's neighbors know what a danger that government and its vision for the region and the world pose. But I think this case is one that we should all speak out about. I think the eyes of the world should be turned to this case. It is an outrage. It is an absolute outrage. And there is no way in the world that we should stand by and allow anyone to be silenced, or anyone to be silent, and particularly our allies around the world and other countries and members of the so-called international community. It's time to step up to the plate and condemn these sorts of things. Because Youssef Nadarkhani not only should he not be facing a death sentence, he shouldn't even be in jail. I thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Texas.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to address the Senate on an amendment that I have to the pending legislation, which will be familiar to my colleagues because it's similar to a bipartisan bill that Senator Menendez of New Jersey and I have introduced, a standalone bill. It's called the Taiwan Air Power Modernization Act of 2011. It does something very simple, but something very important. It requires the United States to respond to a request by the government of Taiwan to purchase 66 F-16 C and D models of fighter aircraft. Why is this important? Well, it's important for all sorts of reasons, one of which is that, as Robert Kaplan recently pointed out in an op-ed in the September 23rd edition of the Washington Post, he said by 2020, the United States will not be able to defend Taiwan from a Chinese air attack. A 2009 RAND study found that even with American F-22s, 2 carrier strike groups in the region, and continued access to the Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, that the U.S. will not be able to defend Taiwan. So it's very important that we sell Taiwan at no taxpayer expense. It's cash money coming from the Taiwanese government to the United States that happens to sustain about 2,300 jobs right here in America, that we sell them these F-16s so they can defend themselves. Dan Blumenthal, in an October the 3rd, 2011 article published by the American Enterprise Institute, lists what he calls the top 10 unicorns of China policy. He says in the article, a unicorn is a beautiful make-believe creature, but despite overwhelming evidence of its fantastical nature, many people still believe in him. And so he lists the top 10 unicorns of U.S.-China policy. The number 2 unicorn relates to the subject of this amendment, and it's entitled Abandoning Taiwan will remove the biggest obstacle to Sino-American relations. In other words, rather than antagonize China, Communist China, by selling 66 F-16 C&D models to Taiwan, some might suggest we should withhold and not make that sale, as the Obama administration has apparently at least decided to do for now, because we don't want to antagonize China. Because if we antagonize China, they're going to be, our relationships will deteriorate. But as Mr. Blumenthal points out, rather than bask in the recent warming of its relationship with Taiwan, China has picked fights with Vietnam, the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, and India. He goes on to say it doesn't matter what obstacles the United States removes, China's foreign policy has its own internal logic that is hard for the United States to shape. Abandoning Taiwan for the sake of better relations is yet another dangerous fantasy. As my colleagues may recall, I introduced this amendment earlier on the trade assistance provisions, the TAA, and the distinguished chairman of the Senate Finance Committee from Montana quoted Ecclesiastes to make the point that it wasn't the right time. He said, for everything there is a season. Well, he also indicated that my amendment might at that time derail the carefully negotiated bipartisan agreement on trade assistance. I didn't agree with him at that time because my amendment was related to trade, because these F-16s represent an export for the United States economy that creates jobs right here at home, in addition to its importance for other reasons. But now the reason for that objection no longer exists. The pending legislation is not a carefully negotiated bipartisan agreement, and I hope my colleagues who shared my concerns or shared the concerns that the chairman of the Finance Committee argued earlier will find it an opportunity to support this amendment on the merits today, because I think it's very important. The chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee argued at the time against my amendment on the TAA bill. He said it was unprecedented for the Congress to force the White House's hand when it comes to foreign military sales. Well, the fact of the matter is, I would remind my colleagues that the Taiwan Relations Act that passed and was signed into law in 1979 makes it clear that Congress has a very important role to play. The Taiwan Relations Act says the President and the Congress shall determine the nature and quantity of such defensive articles and services based solely upon their judgment of the needs of Taiwan. So this is the law of the land, and unfortunately, I don't believe the administration's policy when it comes to selling defensive weaponry to Taiwan, that their agreement that we should just upgrade the existing fleet of F-16s is adequate to meet the demands of the Taiwan Relations Act. This chart, taken from Defense Intelligence Agency materials, public materials, shows the incredible shrinking Taiwan Air Force. Taiwan's projected fighter fleet over time goes from roughly 400 as part of a total of 490 combat aircraft, but the F-5 is an obsolete American aircraft, as you can see, basically because of repairs and needed repairs, replacement parts, and the other is basically not dependable anymore. The French Mirage 2000, it's estimated, will basically drop off the chart shortly after 2015 or so. And then we see the F-16 A and B models, which the administration says we should upgrade, will be roughly 150 of those will be basically the remaining Taiwan Air Force, down from a total of roughly 400 fighters. And actually, the administration's proposed upgrade will essentially take some of these F-16s offline, a whole squadron of F-16 A's and B's, out of service during the retrofit period, further diminishing the number of available aircraft for Taiwan to defend itself. The Taiwan Relations Act was a response to a decision by the executive branch of the federal government that Congress happened to disagree with. One of the great things about our form of government is that Congress can disagree with the administration and force the administration's hand when Congress believes it's appropriate to do so. And the Taiwan Relations Act was one example of that. That decision was based on President Carter's diplomatic recognition of the People's Republic of China and breaking diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Congress had a different view and wanted to make sure that the freedom of the Taiwanese people was secure. And so we passed bipartisan legislation, which was ultimately signed into law by President Carter. But the great thing about the Taiwan Relations Act and the United States' relationship with Taiwan is it's always enjoyed strong bipartisan support. This is not a partisan issue at all. Here's what former Senator Jesse Helms said about it 20 years after the passage of the Taiwan Relations Act. He said, "Now, it's a bit of a rarity when an issue comes up that brings Jesse Helms and Ted Kennedy together. I never served with Senator Helms. I did serve with Senator Kennedy, and I can assure you from what I know of Senator Helms and his record, that was an understatement." But he said this was precisely such an issue, the Taiwan Relations Act. Senator Kennedy, Senator Goldwater, and I, along with Congressman Wolf, Derwinski, and others, set out to ensure that after having their Treaty of Alliance tossed in the trash can, our friends in Taiwan would be left with far more than the vague verbal promises the Carter administration was offering for Taiwan. So we went to work, and the result was the Taiwan Relations Act. I believe, Madam President, that my amendment is a natural extension, or actually a fulfillment, of the Taiwan Relations Act and a reaffirmation of the bipartisan leadership that the Senate has brought, which originally brought Senator Kennedy and Senator Helms together way back in 1979. And we should not depart from that strong bipartisan tradition of supporting our Taiwan and providing the defensive weaponry they need in order to defend themselves, so the United States will not have to fill that gap. During the debates on the Trade Assistance Authority bill that Senator Kerry, the distinguished chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, argued that President Ma of Taiwan is happy with the administration's decision merely to upgrade the existing F-16A and B models and not to replace the F-5s and the Mirages and other aircraft that are fast becoming obsolete. The senator from Massachusetts went so far as to say at the time that the president of Taiwan has said the approved package is entirely adequate. He feels they will have the defensive capacity necessary under the Taiwan Relations Act in order to be able to defend themselves at the current level of the upgrade we are providing. The facts are, Mr. President, the government of Taiwan needs both the existing F-16A and B models plus and upgraded through this upgrade, but also the 66 additional F-16 aircraft that are the subject of my amendment. To quote Taiwan's foreign minister, he said, "Our government will continue to work closely with the United States to strengthen our national defense and security by urging the United States to continue its arms sales to Taiwan with needed articles and systems for our defensive capabilities, including F-16C and D aircraft and diesel-electric submarines." Well, just to remind my colleagues again, this is a familiar chart from the last time I offered this amendment, which shows the growing imbalance of the Taiwan Strait, with China with some 2,300 operational combat aircraft and Taiwan with 490 operational combat aircraft, including 400 fighters as part of those combat aircraft. But the fact of the matter we know is that China doesn't tell the truth when it comes to its defensive and national security expenditures. It discloses only a fraction of what it spends as it projects power across the world to follow its economic needs and interests. Let me quote Taiwan's defense minister. I earlier quoted their another Taiwanese official, but Taiwan's defense minister said the F-16A and B fleet upgrade package and the F-16C and D fighter purchase have different needs and purposes. It's not contradictory to have both cases done. Last Friday, September the 30th, a member of the House Armed Services Committee, who happens to be of the other party, met with President Ma in Taiwan. According to the official press release by the government of Taiwan, President Ma commented that the upgrades of the F-16A and B series aircraft are aimed at extending the life of the fighter jets and avoiding a lack of spare parts due to the age of the F-16A and B series. Meanwhile, Taiwan wishes to purchase F-16C and D fighter jets to replace its aging fleet of F-5E fighter jets. That's in red here, the aging F-5E fighter jets. Therefore, President Ma explained, the objectives of the two are entirely different. Well, Mr. President, let me just leave with one final comment. Several of my colleagues have argued that the Obama administration could later approve the sale of these F-16s, C and D series at a later date, but that's actually not the case. The F-16 production line was recently received a small order from the Air Force of Iraq to sell Iraq F-16s. But without additional orders, the production line will soon be shutting down. The people who are working there will be laid off or reassigned to other jobs. So we're rapidly approaching a point at which the President of the United States will not be able to approve the sale of new F-16s because they will not be able to be manufactured because the production line will be shut down. And I hope my colleagues will keep this in mind as they consider my amendment. But even if the production line was not an issue, why should we make our allies in Taiwan wait? Why would the United States tell our friends to come back later? Well, as I said, the chairman of the Finance Committee quoted Ecclesiastes during our last debate, but allow me to conclude with some wise words from Proverbs. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in your power to act. Do not say to your neighbor, come back tomorrow and I'll give it to you, when you already have it with you. To that, I hope my colleagues would give a hearty amen, Mr. President, and I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The Senate continues in a quorum call after earlier today agreeing to limit debate on the China currency bill by a vote of 62 to 38. Congressional Quarterly reports that could set up passage of the bill later today, with senators eager to depart for the Columbus Day weekend. Also, the Majority Leader, Senator Dick Durbin, and Chuck Schumer and Patty Murray will be heading to the White House this afternoon for a meeting reported to be at 5:30 this afternoon. The Associated Press writes that meeting comes a day after Senator Reid announced that he planned to bring Obama's $447 billion jobs bill up for a vote next week. However, without Republican support, the bill won't get the 60 votes it needed to advance. The president, meanwhile, talked about the jobs bill this morning during his hour and 15-minute press conference and was also asked about the Chinese currency bill, which the Senate is debating.
Obviously, we've been seeing a remarkable transformation of China over the last 2 decades. And it's helped to lift millions of people out of poverty in China. We have stabilized our relationship with China in a healthy way. But what is also true is that China has been very aggressive in gaming the trading system to its advantage and to the disadvantage of other countries, particularly the United States. And I have said that publicly, but I've also said it privately to Chinese leaders. And currency manipulation is one example of it, or at least intervening in the currency markets in ways that have led their currency to be valued lower than the market would normally dictate. And that makes their exports cheaper, and that makes our exports to them more expensive. So we've seen some improvement, some slight appreciation over the last year, but it's not enough. It's not just currency, though. We've also seen, for example, intellectual property, technologies that were created by U.S. companies with a lot of investment, a lot of upfront capital, taken, not protected properly by Chinese firms. And we've pushed China on that issue as well. Ultimately, I think that you can have a win-win trading relationship with China. I'm very pleased that we're going to be able to potentially get a trade deal with South Korea. But I believe what I think most Americans believe, which is trade is great as long as everybody's playing by the same rules. Now, the legislation that is being presented in Congress is an effort to get at that. My main concern, and I've expressed this to Senator Schumer, is whatever tools we put in place, let's make sure that these are tools that can actually work, that they're consistent with our international treaties and obligations. I don't want a situation where we're just passing laws that are symbolic, knowing that they're probably not going to be upheld by the World Trade Organization, for example, and then suddenly U.S. companies are subject to a whole bunch of sanctions. I think we've got a strong case to make, but we've just got to make sure that we do it in a way that's going to be effective. Last point is my administration's actually been more aggressive than any in recent years in going after some of these practices. We've brought very aggressive enforcement actions against China for violations in the tire case, for example, where it's been upheld by the World Trade Organization that they were engaging in unfair trading practices. And that's given companies here in the United States a lot of relief. So my overall goal is I believe U.S. companies, U.S. workers, we can compete with anybody in the world. I think we can make the best products, and a huge part of us winning the future, a huge part of rebuilding this economy on a firm basis that's not just reliant on maxed out credit cards and a housing bubble and financial speculation, but is dependent on us making things and selling things. I am absolutely confident that we can win that competition. But in order to do it, we've got to make sure that we're aggressive in looking out for the interests of American workers and American businesses, and that everybody's playing by the same rules, and that we're not getting cheated in the process. That is a term of art. So, the Treasury Secretary, I've got to be careful here. It's his job to make those decisions. But it's indisputable that they intervene heavily in the currency markets, and that the RMB, their currency, is lower than it probably would be if they weren't making all those purchases in the currency markets to keep the RMB lower.
Mr. President,
The Senator